Well, good evening. Welcome to Regent College's summer public lecture program. It's great to have so many in the building tonight. It's also wonderful to have many people joining us online and many more who will be watching this lecture after it's recorded. My name's Daniel. I'm a first-year MDiv student here at Regent College, and on behalf of our whole community, welcome. A few announcements before I begin and before our program continues. The first is that we'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. If you're new to the building and you need to use the washrooms, they're on the opposite side of the staircase. And if you have to get up at any point in tonight's program, just a reminder to keep the exit area clear. Those are the doors right behind those tables. Now, another thing, if you're here in person, just make sure that your cell phone is silenced so we avoid distractions. And speaking of technology and updates and alerts, this is for both of you in person as well as those of you watching online. If you haven't subscribed to Regent College's newsletter, it's a great way to stay up to date on all these kinds of events, events that are happening online, events that are happening in person. I got a helpful email this week that let me know about a roundtable that was happening and lectures like tonight. So do consider doing that if you haven't yet. The web address is rgnt.net/subscribe. That's rgnt.net/subscribe. Those are all the announcements. So I'm going to pass it over to Christina, who will tell you what we have planned for the evening.
Thank you, Daniel. Welcome, everyone. My name is Christina Louie. I am the host for this evening, and I serve at Regent College as the Associate Director of Advancement. And I'm just delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are both here with us in person and to all of you who are watching online as well. This evening, the format of our lecture is going to be slightly different from some previous nights. It's going to come in two parts, each part divided into two. So if you do the math, it's 4 parts, plus Q&A afterwards. Our very own Jeff Greenman will be our main lecturer, and then we are joined by a special guest, a Regent alum, Petro Kovalev, who will be responding to Jeff's talk. So Jeff will talk, and then Petra will respond, and then that will repeat, and then we will go ahead and have Q&A. So for those in the room, there are microphones set up at the end of each aisle, and we would invite you to come forward with your questions. For those of you who are online, you can send your questions to questions@regent-college.edu. And you can feel free to send those questions all throughout the lecture. That's a privilege you have of being at home and not here. So please do that. And then we'll finish pretty firmly around 9 o'clock, after which time Jeff will actually be in the bookstore and doing a small book signing. So we hope that you'll join him there for that as well. There will be a handout for this evening's lecture, and those of you who are here in person are able to pick one up at the back table. If you don't have one, just raise your hand and Daniel will bring you one. For those of you who are online, we will be showing it at some point, but the font is rather small, so if you would like a copy of the handout, please also email questions@regent-college.edu, and Daniel will send them to you over email. So with that, I'd like to formally introduce you to this evening's speakers. The first is Dr. Jeff Greenman, who is, as I said, both president of Regent College as well as professor of theology and ethics. Jeff has degrees in moral philosophy and political theory from Oxford University, an MDiv from right here at Regent College, and a PhD in religious ethics from the University of Virginia. He's previously taught and served in other seminaries, including at Wheaton College and at Tyndale Seminary. Before taking up these roles in education, he had a wide variety of experiences in the US government around education, juvenile justice, and in politics. He also served as the Canadian Executive Director of African Enterprise, which is a mission agency focused on evangelism, leadership development, and racial reconciliation in urban Africa. So we're glad to have Jeff as our main speaker tonight. And then, as I mentioned, we have one of our very own alumni community, Petro Kovalev. Grateful that he's here. He and his family recently escaped from his home country of Ukraine and have been settled in the Lower Mainland. Petro holds a PhD in theology as well as a master's from here at Regent College. Before leaving the Ukraine, Petro served as Dean of the Modular Bachelor of Theology program at the Ukrainian Evangelical Theological Seminary in Kyiv. And I'm really excited to share with you that he's actually going to be joining the Regent's staff team in early July as the program manager for our Masters of Arts in Leadership, Theology, and Society, which is itself a bit of a modular program. So I know that his expertise in that area is going to be such a gift to our students. He also is accustomed to working with very diverse audiences, and as we know, Regent has such a diverse student body, so we'll benefit from that. And his wide knowledge of languages. I'm not allowed to tell you how many, maybe he will. So with that, I just want to say thank you again, Petro, for being with us today, and we're so glad that you and your family are here in the Lower Mainland. And Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you all for being here. My greetings to each of you on this lovely evening, and to those of you joining us online from wherever you may be. Thanks for being here. So there is this handout, and I'll give you a little guided tour of where we're going, and then say a prayer as we begin. So this is a two-part talk, as Christina is intimating. The first part, I'm going to talk about some of the ideological background of the war. So in your outline, part one, the ideological context for Russia's war on Ukraine. And then after Petro then will respond to my sense about what that is. And then the second half is really a checklist about how authoritarian leadership works. And so then Petro will respond to that too, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So that's how we're going to proceed tonight. And as we begin, I wanted to have us begin with prayer. This is a prayer specifically written for this particular war by David Taylor, who's a Regent alumnus and a professor at Fuller Seminary. So if you can, echo this prayer in your own hearts as I lead us. So let us pray. O Lord, you who are the true King, have mercy, we pray, on the people of the Ukraine this day. Silence the warmongers, scatter the bloodthirsty, shatter the weapons of war, and take pity on the vulnerable, so that true peace and justice may be restored to this land. We pray this in the name of the Prince of Peace. Amen. So first, just to say from Christina's introduction, I'm not an expert on the history and politics of Eastern Europe and Russia. There are such people. I am not them. I am a theological ethicist who studies leadership, among other things, and I've been watching the war in Ukraine very carefully. Now 125 days old. So what you're going to get is a theological ethicist's view of what's going on, rather than a historian's view, although years ago I was thinking in Oxford I studied what was then called the Soviet Union quite carefully. So what I want to say as we start is I think that there's kind of a backstory, if you might say, about what is going on in the Ukraine and the rationale for the war that is not widely talked about, and that it's worth talking about a little bit. So as I say, this war is 125 days old. On the day that the invasion began, on February 24th, Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation, continued to be his words for it, to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Those words should have already signaled to you a strong ideological bent toward the rationale for the war. The war has been widely condemned by Western leaders, but not by all of them, interestingly. Western media coverage was intense at first and has been diminishing bit by bit, scaling up depending upon events on the ground a little bit, but as the war goes on, our interest in these events flags. Hence one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this tonight, was to keep it before our attention. And as someone just said to me today, our attention on the war will probably only be drawn in by our economic interests, so that when gas prices are high or there's food shortages for us, then we'll pay attention. So long as we're not being directly impacted, particularly in our pockets, we won't. We as the West, and I want to raise the question throughout the evening, how should we as the church respond to such realities? The war has been brutal by all accounts, and you've no doubt seen coverage of that, even if you're not seeing a lot of coverage of it. There is heartbreaking levels of destruction and death. Russia is committing unspeakable war crimes, and many of those crimes are under investigation now. There are even persecutions of war criminals already underway. There are so many of those, I don't know how they're ever going to catch up to them all. You have heard about the pattern, and it's a fixed pattern from the beginning of the war to just days ago, of attacking hospitals, schools, civilian residences, and in recent days, shopping mall. This has generated 8 million or so refugees. The number is rising, the largest refugee crisis since World War II. It's estimated that roughly a third of the population of Ukraine is internally displaced. This is having a global economic impact and disruption, and food shortages are a very real reality around the world as a result. So the war is full of evils, and we should be praying for those evils to stop. My title is about the perverse logic of evil, and it's perverse in the sense of odd, strange, or unwelcome, perverse in that sense. And the idea of logic there is that there's a pattern, there's a way of thinking. In a sense, there's a worldview. And so let's start to unpack a little bit of the rationale that is being used. And for those who have ears to hear, this is not new news, but is the continuation of a pattern that Vladimir Putin has been enacting for quite a while. So I want to say there is a deeper ideological and religious background to the war that we don't often hear about that goes beyond the geopolitical, the level of, well, of course, Russia wouldn't want Ukraine as a neighboring country to be in NATO or in the EU and so on. There's many geopolitical realities of that kind, but there's actually a deeper rationale behind them. So I just want to unpack that here in our sort of first part of this talk. The foregrounded rationale of the media and the deep background rationale, I think, can be summarized as this. It's something like making Russia great again, to coin a phrase. And the thesis I want to put before you is that Putin is after, the goal is the reconstitution of the Russian Empire. And the reconstitution of the Russian Empire as a Christian empire, as an Orthodox Christian empire. The religious component is integral to the vision, and more on that in a minute, but it's really about empire. And the logic of empire, if I could say it that way, the way of thinking, the patterns of behaving of empire, as empire has existed around the world for a very long time, are very much evident in how Putin has been tilting the last 20 years of his power and how this war is being unfolded. He has longed not only for the glory days of the former Soviet Union, but beyond that, for the true glory days of the Russian Empire for a very long time. And over time, he has become more driven by ideology as he has become more autocratic in his own power. So he is intensely driven by ideology in my reading. A certain kind of nationalism, a certain kind of social conservatism, a certain kind of autocratic rule are all blended together in opposition to democracy, liberal democracy as it's known in the West, human rights, the United Nations, NATO, EU, etc. And he has taken up the cause of opposition to the West's so-called moral decadence. Some of you may remember when the Olympics were held in Sochi, the great storm around the issue around homosexuality and anti-gay legislation and things like that. That is the forefront of this whole thing in conjunction with the Orthodox Church. That is the big moral issue that signals the decadence of the West, for instance. So we should all know of his profound opposition to democracy and the efforts to undermine democracy from his meddling in the American U.S. election so that Donald Trump would be elected. That was entirely his desire. He hated Hillary Clinton. They had a previous history. But his willingness to meddle in this election also meddled very deeply in Brexit. There are all kinds of stories of this, cyber attacks and all kinds of other antics that are meddling throughout the democratic world with the very processes of democracy. So that's in terms of some tactics that we're a little more familiar with. But beyond that, I'm arguing for a desire to reconstitute the Russian Empire, or Imperial Russia. This was, in its day, one of the largest in the world. The British Empire and Mongol empires have been bigger in the history of recorded time, but in a sense the third biggest one ever in terms of geography is the former Russian Empire. Between 1721 and 1917 are the dates of that, and was ended by the famous Russian Revolution of 1917. Peter the Tsar, Peter the Great as he is known, the first Tsar, was the key leader of this empire, Russia's first emperor, and a ruthless autocrat, and is actually something of a role model for Putin himself. More on that in a minute. It was just the 350th anniversary of Peter the Great, and Putin made a speech on the occasion just a few weeks ago. And the argument was that just as Peter had conquered land on the coast of Sweden in the 18th century, so Putin is doing the same thing in the Ukraine, returning that land and strengthening it by bringing it back under Russian control, which is its proper place, and doing that militarily. So the analogy is what Peter the Great did in Sweden, I am doing in Ukraine. Okay? So here's a quote from Putin directly. Peter the Great waged the Great Northern War for 21 years. It would seem that he was at war with Sweden. He took something from them. He did not take anything from them. He returned what was Russia's. Okay, do you understand? So there's logic for you. And whoever said history wasn't relevant to understanding the present? So the idea there was what they actually took from Sweden was actually Russian in the first place. They were just returning it and strengthening it by bringing it back under Russian control. So that is the logic of what he's attempting to do, to bring Ukraine, which has historically been part of Russia and is really artificially only separate from Russia. So to return and strengthen it by bringing it back under Russian control, and that being done militarily. That's the rationale. That's the analogy with Peter the Great. Ukraine is actually ours, says that logic, and we're just returning to ourselves what was already ours. So there's the defense. So as I say, history is rather important. History is always at stake in these kinds of clashes, and history is always used for ideological purposes. We take up and rewrite history to suit our political agendas, and that's very clearly being done there. So some of this is simply sheer myth-making, and some of it is half-truths, and it's all driven by certain ideological goals. So judging from Putin's own speeches and what his advisors have been saying, the desire for the reunification of peoples, the historic peoples of this Russian Empire now being renewed and ruled by Putin, that would bring Ukraine back under Russian control as Russian territory, is the goal. If you think like an empire, then boundaries are totally artificial and basically irrelevant. Our current fixation with nation states, as you look at them on a map, or seats at the United Nations, are irrelevant if you're an empire. Makes no difference, right? What matters is peoples and nations and land, and that's what he's actually after. So the current national boundaries that you see on a map are irrelevant if you take this long historical view of the greatness of the previous Russian Empire. So he opposes not only the idea that Ukraine is fundamentally a European nation, which President Zelensky says repeatedly, and its strong ties to the West. No, it's much deeper than that. You might remember at the beginning of the war, he said quite famously, Ukraine is not a nation, is not a country. Did you hear that? Do you remember he said that? Were you scratching your head when you heard him say, Ukraine is not a country? You say, well, of course it's a country. It has a flag. It has these colors, by the way. It has a flag. People have passports. Petro has a Ukrainian passport. It says Ukraine on it. Of course it's a country. But no, from the ideological standpoint, the deep historical desire to reunite all of these peoples and all of these lands under Russian control, under his leadership, and under the Orthodox Church, there's no such thing as Ukraine. It's all Russian, right? It doesn't exist in ideological terms. Of course it exists. Petro has a passport from there. Of course you cross a border to enter it. But ideologically, it doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. So it might be a country to us, but it's not a country because Russians and Ukrainians are one people. On July 12th, 2021, just almost a year ago, he made a very long rambling, Putin that is, made a very long rambling speech, which you can find on the internet, on the historical basis for the claim that Ukrainians are Russians and that Russia and Ukraine is one. It's half-truths and an interesting mixture of the story, and I'm no expert on every in and out of what is over 1,000 years of the history of that region. But it's the attempt to make an historical argument that he wound up employing 2 days before the attack, which is to say that Ukraine is not a country. Historically, it is ours. We're just going to take back what is rightfully ours. It's been ours all along, and it should be ours, rightfully under this empire. He says there in that speech, for instance, Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. Listen to the language of spiritual space, right? This is also religious. So the rationalization is that this war is simply reclaiming what is their own territory, restoring and strengthening what properly belongs to Russia. So in light of that, let's start thinking a little bit more deeply into some of the realities of the so-called Russian world. Have you heard this phrase referred to? The Russian world. Ruski mir. It's invoked in this ideology pretty much constantly. So we're now getting down to the deeper roots of the ideology. So this idea of the Russian world, the Ruski mir, it's been essential to his thinking and also that of the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, the patriarch Kirill. Kirill's definition of this goes like this. It is this Russian world. What is it? It is the common civilizational space founded on 3 pillars: Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian culture, and especially the language and common historical memory, and connected to it a common vision of further social development. Okay? So the key elements: Russian Orthodoxy, Russian culture, and the language and common historical memory of these peoples. So the idea behind the Russian world is territorial. It's this empire of not only Ukraine, but also Belarus and probably Moldova, Kazakhstan, as well as it incorporates the Russian and Russian-speaking peoples all over the world under this new empire. The Russian world has a political center in Moscow. It has a language in Russian. The spiritual center is Kyiv. Aha. Where Petro has just come from. Kyiv is the place where the Slavs converted to Orthodoxy. And a very famous moment in 988, the conversion of the Slavs to Orthodoxy takes place in Kyiv. And so it is the spiritual center of this. But yet the common governing church in terms of governance is actually the Russian Orthodox Church from Moscow as its base, the Patriarchate of Moscow. So that in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, this idea of the Russian world was explicitly invoked to justify it, very interestingly. He spoke of Russians as living in a divided nation that needed to be reunited. He talked about the aspiration of the Russian world, of historic Russia, for the restoration of unity, its proper unity. He talked about the necessity of a broad Russian civilization, which has to be protected by external forces from all of the West and all of its evils. And he, of course, defined this sphere, this generally as the sphere of Russian interests pursued. So in light of that, it brings us to the spiritual side and the religious side of all this, right? So hereby we enter the world of how the Russian Orthodox Church has engaged all of this. Putin's view of empire and his idea of sovereignty in political terms these days is determined by culture and language and ethnicity and religion. Okay? Slight digression, but the Western ideal, how is that different from the Western ideal? The Western ideal is multicultural democratic states that are built on the rule of law and the recognition of individual rights. The view of empire that he's pursuing, along with many other of the far-right movements of our day, of which there are so many around the world, want to rather say that sovereignty and rule and nationhood is actually constituted by culture and language and ethnicity, blood, you might say, and religion. So religion is always at the very heart of culture. To quote Richard John Newhouse, culture is the root of politics and religion is the root of culture. So there's another whole level here which isn't talked about very much in the media at all, which is really the theological level. So this renewed Russian Empire is spiritually united in its common allegiance to the Orthodox Church. And together, the Russian Empire, this Christian Russian Empire, will be the best bastion, the world's best defender of all of the horrible decadence of Western cultures and Western societies, and all of the excesses of democracies around the world. So this Russian Empire is a spiritual and political and cultural entity, not just a set of borders. Do you get it? Right? So there's something much deeper going on here. It's what one commentator I read talked about as a social totality. Okay? So in an idealized sense, there is a fusion of church and state in this Russian Empire. And Putin, in fact, has courted, for most of his 20 years in power, the Russian Orthodox Church, offered bribes, he has manipulated them, and he has brought them effectively under his control. He has used the Orthodox Church for his purposes, and the Orthodox Church is using him for their purposes. They are using each other. They are manipulating each other. The background here, in terms of Eastern Orthodox political theology, is the idea of symphony, is what it's called in that tradition. The idea of a harmony, think of music, right? A symphony. The harmony, the cooperation, the deep integration together of church and state, where the state pursues the church's interest and the church defends the state's interest. So the church and state are deeply paired in sharing governance of the empire. It's a Christendom arrangement to the core. So together, the Russian state and the Orthodox Church combine to resist the corruption of the West and to bring about this pure Russian, renewed Russian Empire. The other matter that's at stake here in the war with Ukraine is that in 2019, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church split off and became self-governing as opposed to being governed from Moscow. And that is not what the political agenda of the Russian Orthodox Church is. They want to have the entire operation under their control. So the political agenda of Putin engaging the war fits their spiritual agenda because that's more likely how they will then gain power again over the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which in terms of the way that Eastern Orthodoxy is governed has now become self-governing. You got that? So there's many layers to this desire. The Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church is allegedly a former KGB agent. He is allegedly a billionaire, and he has been very vocally positive, entirely positive about the war in Ukraine. He defends it. He calls Putin's rule a miracle. He, after Putin's various elections, none of which were fairly won, has held prayer services in celebration of them and so on, and is very fond of again, invoking the unity of all of these people spiritually because of the common heritage from the events of 988 with Prince Vladimir's baptism in Kiev. The Russian world, the Ruski Mir idea is deeply theological, and it is supported by the Russian Orthodox hierarchy in Moscow. and then you should know was resisted resoundingly by the Orthodox world in general outside of that sphere. So there is a document from March 13th called A Declaration on the Russian World Teaching, signed by some 500 Eastern Orthodox theologians, which sounds like the Barmen Confession of 1934, which was the great document of resistance to Hitler's rise, orchestrated, mostly written by Karl Barth, at a dire moment in 1934. So it reads very much like that, propositions of why the Russian world teaching is heresy. And so that's why that is such an important document. You can find that also on the internet if you wish, A Declaration on the Russian World Teaching. So all that being said, sets us up for, now, what does this have to do with how the war is being engaged? My third point of part one, and then we'll hear from Petro. The third point of part one is that scenario sets you up to think that there's a reason why the war is so brutal. The adage, I haven't been able to find who said this, but the adage that's been going through my mind is this: war is less brutal if you leave God out of it. And so God is very much in it. Church politics and ecclesial maneuvering is very much in it. So this appears to me as more of a holy war or a crusade than a more conventional war of our times. That's why it's so brutal, because the stakes are so high, completely unjustifiable, morally reprehensible, and truly outrageous in all the ways that it is. But it resembles more a medieval kind of crusade in a sense. Think about the recapturing of Jerusalem from, in the Holy Land from the Muslims and so on of long ago. What are the features of that? To be very brief about what's actually a whole separate lecture, but we don't have time for tonight. It's that first there's a religious purpose to the war, and that's been invoked repeatedly, and Archbishop Kirill or Patriarch Kirill speaks to that constantly. So this Russian world ideology is a spiritual logic, so there is a religious purpose to the war. Number two, classic criteria, it has been endorsed explicitly by a key religious leader. Yes, it has, and is repeatedly so to this day. Thirdly, is there a spiritual reward for those who take part? And yes, there is, because they are repeatedly being cheered as heroes, called blessed, being prayed for, being endorsed. Spiritual reward comes to those who fight the good cause. And so basically, from the standpoint of a medieval crusade to reestablish an empire, you don't have the usual rules of war applicable. There is in common world circulation and the law of the nations, the just war tradition, which has many moral restrictions on the conduct of war, protection of civilians, distinction between combatants and non-combatants, putting certain targets like hospitals and schools and shopping malls out of bounds, etc. There's considerations of proportionality of the kind of destruction that is undertaken in a war. And clearly Putin has no instinct whatsoever to limit the proportionality and the destructiveness of the job. There's no protection or attempt to avoid killing civilians. They're quite directly targeted, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no hint that the laws of war are taken to be applicable, and there's no hint that human rights have anything to do with this from the standpoint of pursuing the war. Hence, it is so awful, and it will continue to be awful as long as it goes, I suggest. So that's very briefly, why does the war look the way it does in moral terms, so utterly disgusting and horrendous? Because it's not a conventional war. It's not being fought according to the rules of war that the nations have agreed upon in these days. It's on a different model. The model fits the empire, and the empire is a Christian spiritual empire. If that's not a pretty disturbing story, I don't know what is. But I'll turn over to Petro for some comments with this summary. So the war is ideologically motivated in pursuit of a renewed Russian empire. It's justified by a particular reading of history, whereby Ukraine is simply a part of Russia and is simply being reunited with its proper homeland. That ideological purpose is explicitly Christian and Orthodox. That's essential to the project. and that the reason for the war being so brutal is that it is in a crusade model undertaken by a leader who does not care about human rights and or anything else represented by the just war tradition. The last thing I'll say as Petro comes up, come on up, is Sweden, the analogy with the Tsar in 21 years in Sweden should be very disturbing to us, because the logic of this case that I've just laid out to you suggests that there's no end in sight until Ukraine is finally completely under control, the whole territory and the whole people return back to the motherland. That's the logic. So that's what you would expect to see carrying on for a very long time, the pursuit of that objective. Question is whether or not that will be successful in the end. Petro's might have been much closer to the scene than I have, needless to say, and so I thought we should hear from him in terms of this rationale. What are your thoughts, Petro?
Доброго вечора, я з України. Good evening, I'm from Ukraine. This is the phrase that many Ukrainians say today around the world, in different parts of the world, in different countries. And this is what I said in Poland, in France, and now in Canada. You know, this topic for me is not a theory. It's something we lived through. This is something my family, my children experienced, beginning from the first day on February 24th, when I heard the missile flying over our house, and I woke up my wife and said, "Darling, wake up, the war has started." We thought it may happen, but till the last moment, it was hard to believe that this will really happen. So few days before, we would pack and unpack our suitcase, emergency suitcase, because we knew if the war starts, we have to escape Kyiv. So we left, we went to Western Ukraine, then to Poland, and finally here to Canada. You know, for many years, I dreamed to come again to visit Regent, to walk here, to see my old friends, but I never thought it would happen under such circumstances. And I'm very glad to hear this lecture, because during all this period, I talked to many people in Ukraine, in Poland, in France. Like, as we were moving here, it took us 3 days because of different circumstances, health issues. We had to spend 2 nights, one in Paris, one in Calgary, instead of 1 day of travel. So one time we were traveling with 2 taxi drivers. One was from Portugal, one was from some African countries, and they asked me about this war. And, you know, the kind of answers they would provide were like, it's all US fault. It's all the West's fault. It's Ukraine's fault. But I'm very glad, I thank you, Dr. Greenman, for this lecture, because now I can give them a link, what lecture to listen. I say, just go to YouTube, type Greenman, Ukraine, Regent College, and listen to this lecture, because you really collected and brought together this excellent material about history, politics, theology. And I firmly affirm this, your main point, that this, the main reason for this war is not because of NATO expansion, not because Ukraine is very stubborn and doesn't want to listen to Russian demands, but the main reason for this war is ideological. And I would even say theological. I like the phrase Kirill Hovorun, one of the prominent Ukrainian theologians, Orthodox theologians, said. He used the phrase theologized ideology. And this is what being used to justify this war. You know, for Russia, this is really a sacred war. And you hear many times phrase, Holy Russia versus sinful West. This is how they view this conflict. And very often they say, we're really not fighting with Ukraine. We are fighting with the West. We are fighting with the West on the territory of Ukraine. And as you've heard today, for them, it's really not Ukraine. Ukraine is not a country. Ukraine is supposed to be part of Russia, part of the Russian Empire, part of the Russian world, Ruski Mir. And this is what this war is about. thank you for this great history background and for these stories and different figures. And I would like to add a few quotes from Putin that maybe will help you to understand better this conflict. One time he was asked about what is the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And for him, it wasn't World War I or World War II, a Holocaust, or Holodomor, where millions of people have died. But he said the greatest tragedy or catastrophe of the 20th century is the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it tells you a lot about his mindset and what is very dear to him. And I think his life goal, the way he wants to be remembered in history as the one who restores the glory of Russia, of Russian Empire, returns the territory of the former Soviet Union, even if possible, like you've heard today, of the largest territory of the Russian Empire, including Poland, Finland, Baltic countries, and maybe some other territories. So it's not just about Ukraine. It involves many, many other countries. And today you may hear, especially from Western politicians, from some political leaders in Europe, that let's settle this deal with Russia. Maybe Ukraine should give up some of the territories, but we will have peace. But I will tell you, we will not have peace, because they will not be satisfied. Once they take this piece, they will take another piece. We've already seen it in history. They took Crimea, then they took Donbass. Now they take the rest of Ukraine as much as they can. And recently, Medvedev, one of the Russian presidents, he said such a phrase. Somebody mentioned about what will happen in 2 years, and he said, maybe in 2 years, Ukraine will not even exist as a country. One time, Putin had a meeting with very bright students, and those were winners of the championship in geography. And he asked one of the students, where does Russia end? And the student gave a proper answer about territorial boundaries of Russia, but Putin said, no, Russia ends nowhere. So it means they will not stop until they achieve what they want to achieve. Another story it happened at the forum in Sochi, Russian city of Sochi, where one of the questions raised was about the threat of the nuclear war and about possibility of nuclear war. And Putin responded in such a way, he said, if this happens, we will die as martyrs and they will just perish. So for him, like dying in this war is like being a martyr for the holy cause. And this is indeed for them is like waging a sacred war against the evil, sinful West. But I would like to make one correction. You mentioned that this war lasts 125 days. In one way, it is correct, but I would say this is how long this full-scale war lasts. But actually, the war began in 2014. If you remember, on February 20th, I remember this date because Russia produced special medals for those who were involved in Crimean operation when they captured Crimea. And on the medal, it says it was engraved the date, February 20th, 2014, and it says Deliverance of Crimea, or Return of Crimea. So this is for them when the war with Ukraine began. They returned one piece of land, then they took over Donbass, and now the full-scale war began exactly 125 days ago. So I think this war will continue, and Putin will not stop unless he will be stopped by joint efforts of Ukraine, Canada, United States, Europe, and other countries. And I would like to thank all Canadians for your warm welcome of Ukrainians and for your support of Ukraine from the very first day. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. I take that correction too, that 2014. This is the continuation of what began in 2014. Okay, so back to your handout now. Where are we? This is possibly the longest handout in the history of evening public lectures at Regent College. Thank you for your indulgence with my excessive handouts. This is so you can take this home and use this as a checklist for watching the news. Pay attention to the leaders around the world, not least Putin, but others too. There are many of them who are authoritarian. And this is the playbook. So I would submit that virtually all of these things you can find Vladimir Putin fulfilling, but lots of other world leaders fulfill them as well. There's a logic to authoritarian leadership, whether it's at the level of nation states or whether it's the level of companies or churches or denominations or many other forms. So I'm not going to go through every bit of this, but let me just set this up and tell you what I've given you here. So look at my point 4 on the outline. So I'm just using Putin in a sense as an example here, excuse me, of a wider phenomenon. Putin's leadership displays a recurring moral-spiritual and therefore political pattern of history. What I'm driving at is, in a sense, there's a moral spiritual vision that undergirds and empowers, directs such people, that then has political manifestation rather than the other way around. The familiar and ruthless pattern has an abhorrent yet consistent logic or script, which is quite coherent and even compelling to some people on its own grotesque terms. You should be pretty clear from that what I think about this. And here's the quote from Putin to Joe Biden. Biden is vice president at this point. You look at us and you see our skin and then assume we think like you, but we don't. And so the former ambassador to Russia, McPhail, who's actually a scholar of Russian history and politics, I've been reading his articles recently, he quotes this, and it's so true. And so my premise, point 6 here, the premise is, back to point 5 for a minute before I go on. In other words, that picture that I just painted and Petra was filling out even further, it might not make sense to you. You might find it abhorrent, but it does make sense to certain people on its own grotesque terms, right? And then supported by a propaganda machine, it becomes absorbed by millions and millions of people. Point 6, the premise here. There's a common and appropriate human yearning for identity, meaning, significance, belonging, security, and unity. The question I want to raise is, how do we pursue all of those good things? So my idea is very driven by the biblical narrative, in a sense, the story of the two ways, the narrow gate and the wide gate, the narrow gate that leads to life and the wide, broad path that leads to destruction. On my proposal here, I also quote from the Didache, which is a document, if you're not familiar with, one of the most important and earliest of Christian documents from the early part of the 2nd century, which begins with the statement that I quote there. There's two ways, one of life, one of death. There's a great difference between the two. And my quote from my friend Joel Scandrett, a theologian in the U.S., we either seize the ring of power or submit to the rule of love. There's no middle way. So I've given you a binary chart here, and usually I'm fairly suspicious of binary charts as being oversimplifications, as much as I tend to produce them sometimes for teaching purposes. But on this one, I think there's a very, very huge gulf running down the middle of this outline between the typical authoritarian pattern on the left, which is a broad path to destruction, and the narrower road to the right. So I'll tell you what I've been trying to do. Over time, and it's been years now of accumulating, that's how this handout got to be so long, I've been just keeping a running list of how I've noticed autocratic leaders working. And the list kept getting longer and longer and longer, and my goodness, look what you've got. You've got the longest handout in the history of evening public lectures. I didn't mean to do that to you, but the idea here is that in spelling out the logic, it's a multifaceted, complex logic. The left side all hangs together. It all makes sense. It all interprets, every piece interprets the other pieces. The right hand also holds together, I would submit, and each of the pieces interpret one another, reinforce one another, and overlap with one another, just as much as the left-hand side does. But there's a broad, broad, broad ditch in between the two. one leading to destruction and one leading to life. It's my suggestion. So one is a way of foolishness, and I have the Machiavellian quote, fear, better to be feared than loved. This is a worldview. This is one of the points I want to emphasize. I'm just going to underscore a few of these before we open it up for discussion. The one at the bottom of the page about worldview I think is really, really significant. This always has political implications. So on the left-hand column, what I say there is the world's chaotic order reflected in, say, Genesis 3, is all there ever has been or all there ever will be. It is the Hobbesian world, Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, English philosopher, where life is nasty, brutish, and short. The world always has been and always will be broken. It's just brokenness and distress all the way down. That's all there ever has been and that's all there ever will be. You have no idea how significant that is at the level of politics. Because it's just a world of power. It's a world of might. It's a world of the biggest fish in the sea eats the littlest fish. It's just might makes right. It's a whole logic. If all there is distress and power, and conflict, that's the game. And you play the game and you play to win. That's how autocrats think. The other side of it is, of course, look at the narrative of the banners behind me here, from creation to new creation. It's a perfect example. You have a visual aid right behind me. Creation is good, says God. Even a fallen world reflects the Creator's design, and there is a new world coming at the other end of the banners, right here. There's a new world coming. So it's not from chaos to chaos. It's from peace and shalom and blessing to peace and shalom and blessing through a way of redemption in the middle of the sinfulness and brokenness. Right? That has direct political implications for the way that you operate a shared pursuit of, what did I say here before, identity, meaning, significance, belonging, security, and unity. You do it in a totally different way if it's a story of from shalom to final shalom, as opposed to just brokenness and distress and violence throughout. So if the world is, this is ancient Near Eastern creation stories as well. If the world is born of violence, violence becomes the only way the world can possibly have. If the world is born of peace and blessing, there is a way of peace and blessing that the world can have. So along the way, I won't go through all of these, but you see some of the significance of these things. Of course, competition and power and survival of the fittest is the way that you would operate. Of course, competition and combat is going to yield the best results. This is all a self-generated worldview. It's all that the purpose of life is something that you discover for yourselves as a community. But your community's sense of what that purpose is becomes ultimate because there's nothing above and beyond it. There's nothing that transcends it. Nothing that transcends it, right? So some of this is just how depressing it is to live in an immanent worldview with no further accountabilities or no further hopes. Self-interest, self and group promotion, survival, promotion of the in-group, and so on becomes the purpose. So that's exactly what happens in oligarchies. That's what autocrats do. They surround themselves with cronies, and they pursue in-group self-interest in the name of a bigger group, but never gets blessed. The politics and religion piece is an interesting one. So there's two options there in my left-hand column called politics and religion. You can do two moves. One is to say, as I say here, politics is politics, religion is religion. They should just be kept private, kept separate. They have nothing to do with one another. So that there would be no religious accountabilities to anything that goes by politics or government. Or, alternatively, as you see in the Russian empire building attempts, that religion is co-opted and manipulated by politics, subsumed under political ambitions, so the nation-state's destiny is a sacred destiny, which is just what Petro was talking about in this current conflict. But the same thing is true of many other places around the world. The nation-state is sacralized. Its own destiny becomes the spiritual destiny, and there's nothing else beyond it. With this goes the self-perception of innocence, superiority, and achieved purity. We are the pure, us and them logic starts kicking in. Grievance, fear, anger, greed, and so on become deeply motivating, driving the whole enterprise. The us and them is evident in the racial ideologies. Yes, I am thinking about Nazism here. I am thinking about American racism in the South and slavery. That all of these kinds of regimes are building on a racial hierarchy, no doubt about it. The Aryan race in its mythologies in Germany, for instance. All the rest of that. Others are a threat. Enemies are to be killed and destroyed. You are to serve me, serve my interest. I'm not serving you. Trust, compassion, support, cynically manipulated, right? That's the manipulation through propaganda, among other things. The past is a fascinating one here. I'll just comment on that, a couple more comments before we close. I say here, nostalgia, a quest to reclaim a mythic golden era or the glory days. So a deep attachment to something that we're making great again. I said, you know, this is making Russia great again. There's an empire he has in mind, a certain period of time. This is true of Hitler. This is true of all of these autocratic leaders and fascists around the world are invoking a golden era of some time, rewriting the past to justify their political ambitions for the future. Be careful how you read and interpret history, friends. Education, seeing as we're at a theological college, this is an interesting one. So the authoritarian move is to turn education into indoctrination. Right? It's to glorify this mythic past that you have created. It's to boost the hierarchical norms and the particular national traditions that you want to champion, and it's to obscure or obliterate or completely ignore those perspectives or histories that don't fit your narrative, so that education becomes deeply politicized. And this is happening around the world. It's happening in China right now, the way they're rewriting textbooks of what's going to be taught in Hong Kong going forward. So many examples of all of this. So the rest of this unfolds rather grimly, I must say, but you see that there's a certain kind of logic that goes on here. Law means that whatever the leader says it means. There's no such thing as the rule of law and all people being equal under the law and the leadership be accountable to the law. No one's higher than the law. No, no, no. The law is whatever the leadership or the ruling clan decides it to be, which is in their own interests. That's the way authoritarianism works. The rules don't apply to them. Violence, here, I just draw attention to this one. I say here the authoritarian pattern adopts the myth of cleansing violence. And that's definitely what's going on in the current situation with Ukraine. Right? This is a spiritual battle, so to speak, right? The purity of the renewed Russian Empire is at stake. The virtues, these are virtues of strength. These are the machismo kind of virtues. The one thing you cannot tolerate is weakness, vulnerability, and compassion. You might have seen our own Prime Minister here in Canada, along with Boris Johnson, mocking Putin's penchant for riding around bareback on horseback. Did you notice that? They were kind of mocking him. Well, that's Putin, right? This is the macho, masculine, power, strength thing. Vulnerability, weakness, compassion are all mocked, ridiculed. And then the last things I wanted to say were particularly about the leadership stuff here, the top of page 4. There is a model of leadership here, which is what I would call heroic leadership. We are very drawn to heroic leadership. It calls in this model, in the Putin, Bolsonaro, Xi model, etc., for absolute submission to the leader, unquestioning, and often a cult of personality. Right? We've seen that around the world. That's far, far, far from an idea of servant leadership. Heroic leadership and servant leadership are opposite ends of the spectrum. Our servant leader wound up on a cross like that, which isn't exactly the model of heroic leadership. The tactic is about command, control, domination, retaliation, vengeance, and retribution. Not anything over in my right-hand column, which would eschew all of those things. No vengeance, no retaliation, no retribution. I don't think anybody who's read the Sermon on the Mount can think otherwise. And the last thing is about the leadership dynamic. I've been quite fascinated for a long time by the dynamics of narcissistic leadership, and we've seen many world leaders that are caught in that. But the leadership dynamic, its operational code, you might say, that's written into it. No empathy, no listening, no compassion, dismissing other people, and very self-indulgent and self-enriching. This is the pattern of oligarchy, where 300 or 400 Russians own something like, I don't know, ridiculously huge amount of the Russian economy. So it's self-serving in a rather brutally corrupt way. The last thing I want to say down at the bottom is there's got to be some hope somewhere, but if your hope is only imminent, it's a pretty grim picture. I say here, hope is imminent. What humans accomplish, the triumph of our group, our cause, our nation, triumphing over our enemies, that is our hope. The hope of this story lands there in the coming of the city of God, right? This is the coming down. That's the last trumpet. That's the city of God. That's the new heavens and the new earth. That's when all things are put right. That's when all is healed and brought to a true and deep harmony and unity in recognition of the true and living God. And that's a totally different piece. So I just want to suggest that we hang on tightly to the hope of the gospel, because there is no other hope in the world. And the left side column desperately needs the good news of the right side and the hope of the gospel, especially in the face of conflicts like this one. Last comment, I got a quote here from Solzhenitsyn, that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor through classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart. All of what I've been talking about in rather drastically condemnatory terms on the left-hand side has to do with the state of our hearts. And so does the right-hand column have to do with the state of our hearts. So all of this business of geopolitics and empire building and so on actually comes always back to matters of fundamental postures and of the state of all of our hearts. Last thing is, if you want some extra reading along the lines of authoritarianism, fascism, what's been going on, I have some wonderful books, Ann Applebaum and Timothy Snyder, Jason Stanley, more contemporary ones, all excellent and very, very, very readable. And then Hannah Arendt's famous study on totalitarianism, written right after World War II. I'll leave it there and have Petro come up and give us some response to the playbook of authoritarian leadership, and then we'll have your questions. So be thinking of your questions, and we'll have some discussion. Okay? Petro, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent chart, and very detailed. And I would like to add some points to it. One thing that I see is very prominent in this conflict is idea of pride versus humility. I think Putin and many Russians, they feel they have been humiliated during Cold War. Russia lost, the Soviet Union lost this war, and now they want to take back. So they want their pride to be restored. And many of them openly talk about dreaming about all good old times when everybody was afraid of us, when they really respected us. So they want to return those times when Russia or Soviet Union was strong and they were one of the superpowers. So this is what Putin wants to see now happen again. Also, I would like to, the other two things to compare is domination and servanthood. One of the things we see, and especially in Russian news, Russian talk show, this is probably one of the most terrible things you can watch or listen to now, when they're really not afraid to talk about bombing Western Europe. Like recently I watched one video where they openly talk about bombing Netherlands, because a lot of weapons that comes from Netherlands. So many of them say, may the world perish if Russia is not the way they see it. So they're willing to destroy the world if their ideology doesn't succeed. And we know from the scripture that pride always follows by the fall. So I believe this Russian world system will fall. But we have to continue to fight against it. We have to protect the innocent who suffer right now. Yeah, and another thing, you mentioned about this in your chart, but lie, propaganda versus truth. Like a lot of people in Russia, they don't have access to at least variety of opinions. Internet is censored. All you can see on TV is just state politics, and it's very opposite to the open atmosphere where we can discuss different ideas, where we can disagree, where we can present different perspectives. So we always see in authoritarian regimes and leadership a lot of propaganda, censorship, restrictions, comparing to being open to discussion, talking, and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Very, very helpful, absolutely. Propaganda is the way of these empires. So, do you want to field our questions and get us going?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so very much, Jeff, and thank you, Petro. You can come stand here.
Yeah, come on with us.
For really stimulating. I know we have some questions here in the room as well as some online, so I'll just go over here to this microphone first. I'll just remind you to keep your questions succinct and short. I might even cut you off if you go too long. Thank you. So go ahead.
Hi. I just wondered if you have a sense of the extent to which Putin's religious, cultural vision is shared by his inner circle and the oligarchy there? Or are they just in it for themselves, do you think?
That's a very good question. Do you want to answer that one? To what extent is Putin's vision shared by his key leadership around him?
I'll share my personal opinion. In my sense, probably majority of leadership in Russia would share the same perspective. Probably not, they would not be as strong in their persuasions, and probably they would like, for example, to use more soft power instead of what he is doing right now. But this idea of making Russia great again and restoring this glory of the empire, many of them, I would say, majority would share.
Thank you, Petro. I'm just going to remind our audience at home that you can still email questions to questions@regent-college.edu, and then we'll go right over here to Paul.
Thanks very much, Jeff. It's very interesting and engaging. I'm interested in your thesis that Putin's vision is specifically Christian. And I mean, obviously, I'd like to learn more about that. But it made me also think one of the quotes that Petro gave us about Putin saying that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union, which of course was not a Christian empire at all, but an avowedly atheist and anti-Christian. And so it's interesting that he would see the fall of that state or that regime as a great tragedy rather than, say, the fall of the Tsarist Russia in 1917. So it just makes me wonder whether it's Russian power as such, or how important is the Christian aspect of that in his vision?
Well, let me say something, then you can say something too. I think the Christian vision is because there's this idea of a spiritual motherland and a spiritual unity. And as Petra will tell you, the population identifies itself as very heavily Orthodox. 70 or 80% of the population church-going is actually very small, maybe less than 10%, according to various stats. So it's not that there's a drive in our terms of sort of evangelical zeal for the pure spiritual experience that everyone will have, so much as the common, in a sense, culturalized spiritual homeland that will unify everybody over against sort of all of our enemies, so to speak. So it's got to be a kind of fusion of church and state for it to be a true spiritual homeland for people. You want to say more about that?
Yeah, one idea that kind of wasn't mentioned today, but probably should be mentioned, is the idea of the third Rome. Maybe you've heard about it, of Russia being third Rome. And many people who hold to this concept of Russian world believe that Russia has special mission from God, a special mission for this world. And of course, this would differ, for example, from, let's say, Putin and maybe Kirill and maybe some of the Orthodox priests. Many, let's say, Orthodox priests, they believe that Orthodoxy is the true Christian faith. Catholics are wrong, Protestants are wrong, and their mission is to bring true Christian faith to the whole world. So often this idea would overlap with ideological idea of the empire, and they would often support one another. And yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to go for a question online from Daniel.
Yeah, our first question from online comes from Graham at Charles Strutt University in Australia. And he has the following to say: I fully support Dr. Greenman's stress upon the empire ideology, including its theological strand, that's at work in Putin's thinking. And I see the connection between that thinking and Putin's strategic purposes. But Jeff, you claim that this empire thinking also explains the tactile features of Putin's war, its particular brutality, including the rejection of just war principles. Graham's asking, I need some further persuasion to be convinced of that latter half. His question is, what's the connection exactly between the empire thinking and the particular brutality of the war? I understand that it's fashionable to appeal to the Crusades in this connection, but he wonders if, as G.K. Chesterton would point out, that this can be a bit of hand-waving. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I'm pushing the argument there, and I'm glad to be tested by Graham and potentially others who are here. The idea, I guess, that I have in mind is that the logic of empire knows no bounds, and it shall not be bounded, including by Western made-up rules about how warfare is legal or illegal, and what's acceptable or unacceptable. We don't accept that whole set of assumptions that are behind those things. And so if the desire is, in a sense, this reclaiming of what is ours, what matters is ultimately its success in the end. The end is going to justify the means. So all those efforts to constrain the means are really irrelevant and not on his horizon. I'm not saying that's explicitly on his mind. I'm not saying he's sitting around a war room cabinet saying, well, since we don't believe in the just war tradition and since we're doing a crusade, we're going to go kill civilians. But the logic is there's nothing in his worldview that is preventing him from attacking civilians and shopping malls and maternity hospitals. There's no other check in his moral compass, you might say, that's preventing any of those things. The desire on the left-hand side of the chart all goes together, and I think that the lack of any sort of boundedness morally is a part of that picture. Do you have thoughts about that in terms of, does this help explain the way the war is being conducted?
Yeah, I totally agree. I probably wanted to say the same. Maybe I'll just give one example. This war also broken down many families. My wife's family is in Crimea, and not the whole family, not the whole extended family supports Putin in Russia, but some of the family does. And talking one time to one of the relatives and describing what we have experienced and how people we know have died and were killed and were in bomb shelters. This relative, I will not say who that was, but basically said, well, it's hard, but it is necessary. Like they see that these are necessary measures that have to be taken for this high and lofty cause that they have.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We'll go over here.
I lived in Ukraine for 13 years just after Perestroika. So interesting that you mentioned that Kirill used to be KGB, and we know that Putin was leader of the KGB, and for 70 years, communism was atheistic. So in other words, anybody who believed in God, that way they were, in a sense, stupid, because if God doesn't exist and you believe in something that doesn't exist, well, then you're stupid, therefore you can't go to university, you can't get a higher education. And so if Putin then is the leader of the KGB, that would mean he'd be atheistic and doesn't believe in God, and that would be the party line, but that would also be the true belief. The fact that Kirill was also KGB would mean he's also a non-believer. And many of the Orthodox priests and the pastors who continued to be faithful believers were either shot or killed or put into Siberia. A lot of the Orthodox priests were then false people were put in place. KGB agents were put in place of the Orthodox priests so they could hear confessions. Once they heard confessions, then the KGB could arrest those individuals. And so therefore nobody trusted the Orthodox Church during the communist times. So my question is, what kind of a conversion then did Putin have, and what kind of a conversion does Kirill have? That's one. And then the other thought for a second, orthodoxy. Ortho is right, and doxy is praise, the right praise, the right practice. If that's the case, and we want to have true Christianity, then anything that is not true Christianity is pagan, and anything that's pagan can be sacrificed, and there are no rules or laws for that. And so therefore, in a Christian war of being true Christians, we need to get rid of the false Christians or anybody who's not, and therefore that makes everything permissible, and there is no morality at all involved in that because it's an orthodox kind of a war. So if you want to, I'll stop there and let you comment on either of those two.
Well, your latter point is an interesting sort of logic, again, you're trying to tease out, which is worth thinking about. I'd have to think about that some. Your first point, I don't want to speculate about individuals in terms of Putin and Kirill, but I mean, Putin goes through the usual religious rituals, and so what kind of conversion has he had? I don't know, but he's certainly willing to play a certain part symbolically within the sort of political, national, religious fusion that he's after, and play certain parts. And as for Kirill, I really don't know what to say. Do you have any comments about the two of them and their KGB backgrounds and potential conversions?
I think the figure of Kirill is quite complicated. It would take kind of a long time to talk about that. But as far as Putin, I think he found orthodoxy useful for his goal. And that's why he supports orthodoxy. And I think many Orthodox, probably including Kirill, they found that they can use Russian state. So they kind of, each side wanted to use each other, but it seems like true orthodoxy lost because it became dominated by this ideological idea of the Russian world and lost all the beautiful things that there are in orthodoxy. By the way, maybe some of my comments that I mentioned, negative comments about Orthodox Church, should not apply to all Orthodox, because I have a lot of wonderful friends who are Orthodox, who are against Putin, against Kirill, against this doctrine of the Russian world. But I think here we see a good example how two sides, they kind of found something useful in each of them, and they kind of join efforts. And now it seems that, I feel that Kirill, he sees the problem, and obviously he understands that Orthodox Christians are being killed, because also like 70%, at least nominally, of Ukrainians are Orthodox. But I think he went so far that there is no way back for him right now.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just going to go here, and then right after his, you can take one from online, Daniel.
I'm curious to know, in your opinion, how far back the entrenched opposition goes back between the West and the East, or more specifically the West and Russia, and whether or not the opposition really emerged as a Christian opposition between the Latin West and the Greek East, and then the later migration towards Russia, or whether it was between the West and the rise of communism, and like where did this tension really begin, and how it's gone along over time.
Big question.
Yeah, it probably has very long and complicated history, but let me share again personal example. I grew up in the Soviet Union under communist times, so I remember all the news we watched on state TV were about how terrible is the West and how wonderful is USSR and all Soviet blocs, a bloc of countries. So it has been propaganda throughout the whole Soviet times, but now it is propaganda that is in Russian, on Russian TV, Russian newspapers. Just open any Russian websites and just read the news, and all you see how terrible things are in the West and how great are things in Russia, and kind of we are regaining strength, our military is strong, and we are saving Ukraine and Ukrainian people from those Nazis, and we are having success. So probably this history of this conflict is quite long, and complicated, but it has been lasting for many, many years.
Yeah, and one thing to add with regard to Putin, within Putin's 20 or so years of power, he was more pro-West and involved in the G8, and of course got kicked out of the G8, now to the G7. He was more favorable towards the EU in the early part of his reign. He's turned more and more against all of this as time has gone by. So he's taken up more of the us over against the West logic with real vehemence, even in the last decade. It's been accelerating, and now it's reached a fever pitch. And as Petro was saying, now this symbolically is his war against the West. So he needs to win, because the logic is we must win in order to have this Russian world. That's the scary thing, which is then if there's no real moral boundaries around it and we must win to demonstrate our superiority, to reclaim the motherland, then the implication is this will go on a very long time until he is stopped, as Petro said. That raises all the rest of the geopolitical questions around NATO, role of American military intervention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he's moved from being more favorable to the West to very anti-West, anti-democratic during the space of his own rule.
Maybe I should add, there was, at a certain time, I don't remember exactly the years, but there was even consideration of Russia joining NATO. So, and now you see the totally opposite perspective.
That's an example of that.
This question from Anson is a similar, actually the other angle of what, Petro, you were talking about in terms of the one media response that you're seeing within the Russian culture. So he's asking it from the other angle. He says, discussions about these important issues would often end up in an impasse among friends where people would just blame media bias and claim there's no way to find out the real truth. So with so many competing claims of truth on the internet, sustaining a rational discourse or simply agreeing on basic facts has been very difficult. How should we deal with this epistemological crisis on our end in response to Ukraine?
My chart talks about the difference between indoctrination and education's about critical thinking. So all the same rules that we should all be practicing in our digitized, social media-driven world apply to this as well. Consult reliable sources. Check them out. Verify. Read from more than one source. Don't live in an echo chamber. Read something you don't read. Read Al Jazeera, as one of our board members recommends. So you just have to be careful. But also, I from time to time watch Russia television, RT. You know, the nation. Do you get that on your TV wherever you are? Right? It's the Russian propaganda network all around the world. It was on my hotel room TV in Singapore when I was there at the beginning of the war. So you can also watch the Russian Western propaganda machine at work through RT. So take it all in, think critically, use reliable sources. Anything else you want to add to that? Yeah.
We'll do Bill and then Peter and then one more from Daniel.
Thank you, Jeff and Petro. My question is about the logic of the rather tepid support from the majority world for Ukraine. Most of the majority world was made up of colonies in the not too distant past. They've been under the thumb, as have the population of Russia, which seems, on the surface at least, to be fairly behind Putin, albeit with important levels of dissent and some very courageous people. But why the lack of support in the majority world? Is that leftover dynamics from an anti-Western viewpoint? But anyway,
well, let me
function
start.
Of oligarchy, perhaps?
Let me start and let Petro finish. It's interesting that those that have not really signed on in terms of opposition to the war, spoken out vocally, many of them, you'd have to sort of start counting up, but some very prominent countries from the majority world that are led by autocratic dictators themselves have not spoken up. Putin's strategy, think about Syria, right? Why was Syria such a big deal? He wanted to make sure Assad was not overthrown. He wants to make sure dictators are not overthrown. And so there is the kind of unspoken pact probably amongst some of these figures. So, for instance, India has not spoken up. Modi, who's another autocrat, has not spoken up about this. Bolsonaro in Brazil, another autocrat, has not spoken up about this. So you're looking at, over 1 billion people in India, 200 some odd million in Brazil. So I think that's some of the explanation. I don't have all of it. I don't quite understand the whole dynamic around it in terms of smaller nations or others that are more democratic and so on. But there is an economic dependence upon the oil and gas, of course, as well as the food production. And they're risking some of their own livelihood. And people will take stands about political issues based on their own economic interests in very many cases. Do you have thought to add to that?
African countries, yeah.
Especially African countries, says Petro. So.
Yeah, we only have a couple minutes left, so Peter, if you want to direct your question to either Jeff or Petro, go ahead.
To Jeff, if you're in dialogue with the Archbishop as a fellow Christian leader, what would you say to him?
The Archbishop, which one?
The Russian one.
The Russian one. What would I say to him?
What sort of dialogue would you want to have as a fellow Christian leader?
Petro, do you have an answer to that? I think I'd want to have a conversation around what does he think the kingdom of God is? Because I think there's a kind of mistakenness of the arrival of a renewed Russian Empire with the arrival of the kingdom. Want to talk about what the gospel is and what good news is. And try to understand how the logic of the Russian world can possibly be theologically sustainable. I don't know. Is that what you're thinking? What would you say? Tell me. What did you have in mind?
Your line about what is the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
So you're trying to have a dialogue where there could be something that is shared, but actually its interpretation is different.
Yeah, I would hold out hope of that in good Christian good faith, I suppose. I don't know. Hadn't really thought about that.
Daniel, go ahead. Is yours directed?
I need a plane ticket to Moscow.
We'll see who wants to take it, I think.
Okay.
It's a tough one. 2 parts. First, how would you compare the American evangelical right in corroboration with Donald Trump and the Russian Orthodox Church and liaison with Putin? And then the second part of the question is, we've named a lot of atrocities over the centuries that have been committed by alignment with churches that may fly banners similar to those behind us, that may tell us similar stories. So thinking back to Nazis' church collaborating with Hitler, American South with racism, Crusades. How do you differentiate those 2 logics?
Well, I'd say the left-hand column is applicable worldwide. And I would say that the fusion of church and state in an uncritical, sort of mutually reinforcing cooperative arrangement like Petro was talking about is always hazardous. In the fusion of church and state, my reading of 2,000 years of Christian history is it's usually the state that comes out on top. And it's usually Christianity that is compromised. And in this case, you're seeing, I think this pretty significantly, the manipulation of Christianity by certain political nationalist interests. You have seen the political manipulation of a lot of Christianity in America. But it's not only there, it goes on all over the world. It's a global phenomenon. The left side of the chart applies pretty much equally everywhere. And I'm trying to just alert anybody and everybody from whatever nation or background that you're connected to be on the watch for the markers of the left-hand column. We're living in days of the rise of authoritative dictatorial leadership. It is all over the world, and it takes many forms, increasingly this far-right form that we have, but it could be a far-left form. We should always be vigilant about it, and I haven't made the whole case. It's another whole lecture for the right-hand column leads you to parliamentary democracy. And I think we need to prize it and care for it very, stridently, as opposed to the logic and where the left-hand column leads you.
We're really at the end of our time, so I'm going to just ask Petro to give any final reflections or thoughts that he wants to share with us before we formally finish. So Petro, I'll turn it over to you for a moment.
I just wanted to share that usually in those difficult times like war, not only terrible things happen, but also a lot of beautiful things happen. And maybe I just wanted to mention about amazing cooperation we see basically all around the world among different churches. Maybe just one example. When I was in Poland, I tried to be as much as helpful to Ukraine as I could. And it was amazing to see like people from different countries would come to Poland, would come to Ukraine, and we would have, for example, somebody in Canada donating money for vans, which one Polish guy was searching all over Poland, the best deals. He would call us, and me and my friend would go to different cities and towns, buy those vans and bring them to the warehouse in the Warsaw. Then some volunteers from United States of Ukrainian background and even not Ukrainian background would come and load up those vans with humanitarian aid. Then some other, I don't even know what nationality they are, would take those vans across the border. Then they would pick up those vans, unload this humanitarian aid, and take those vans to evacuate people from dangerous zones. So you can see amazing manifestation of how the body of Christ should work in such difficult circumstances. So in the midst of this war, I would like to also remember those heroes. For example, one of my students, he was killed because he brought humanitarian help to Bucha. And Russian soldiers caught him, tortured him, and finally killed him. And he was found in one of the mass graves. So let us remember those people who are real heroes, sacrificing their lives. And I would like to thank Canadians, Polish people, American people, people from all around the world for supporting Ukraine and helping Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jeff, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think to start, kind of go back to where I started, I think to keep this reality alive, keep it on your own heart and in your prayers, in your circle. I wonder how many churches are still aware or praying for Ukraine. We maybe did at the beginning of the war, but not so much now. These things tend to fade. So hope this has brought this to mind for you in a special way, and maybe we could share some of the insight we might have had or concern that we have for this situation with others to keep this from falling off the radar screen. That'd be my encouragement for you, but just generally to say thank you for your time and attention, both here and you folks online, for sharing with us. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Petro, for coming and being with us tonight. And if you do want to keep this on the top of your hearts and minds and share this with those in your communities, very shortly this will be available on Regent's YouTube channel, so you can share the lecture with others as well. We have a full slate of excellent content, not necessarily about Ukraine, but on many wide-ranging topics happening throughout the college all of the time. Next week alone, there are 2 different evening public lectures as well as a faculty roundtable. Our evening public lectures take place on Monday and Wednesday evening. They are both in person and online. We have Wesley Hill, who will be speaking on Monday, and then Jules Martinez Oliveri next Wednesday evening. If you are here in Vancouver in person, on Wednesday there is a faculty roundtable looking at gender dynamics in the New Testament with Wesley Hill and Lynn Cohick, and then many more things throughout the next 4 to 5 weeks of summer programs. So we invite you to participate in all of those however you can. Finally, I'd really like to thank those who are financial supporters of Regent College. Without financial support, we would not be able to host content that is as deep and thoughtful and meaningful and formative for mature and nuanced Christian faith. So if you have never given to the college, or if you are a regular giver, I would like to invite you to think about supporting the college just in the way that this lecture has been so supportive of the ways we think and live in the world. There's a donation box at the back of the table. You can also give on the internet at rgnt.net/give. We do this mission because we have supporters around the world, just like so many of you, so thank you. And finally, please do take a chance to browse the bookstore. The bookstore is another critical part of enabling Regent College in offering meaningful content and education just like this. And Jeff will be there to sign whatever books of his you buy. So there you go. Thank you again so much. Have a wonderful evening. God bless.